Alright guys, welcome to the second video in this Walnut Tea Cabinet series. So in this one we're going to be prepping these panels that we made in the last video for the actual cutting of the joinery. So we're going to be using hand-cut dovetails on the four outside corners of this cabinet. And so we want to make sure that these panels are as flat and square as possible, and they're the same length, all that kind of stuff. And so the reason for this is because when you're cutting joinery, you want everything to be as even as possible. Just makes the job a hell of a lot easier. And so what we need to do right now is we need to prep these panels. So right now there's lots of glue squeeze out still dried on the top because I didn't do a good job of cleaning it up when it was drying. That was my bad, I should have done that. So we're a little over a 1/16 over the thickness of what we actually need for the final piece. So we want to make sure at this point in time that we get these panels down to their final thickness. That way, again, they're ready to go once we start doing our joinery. And so the last thing we're going to do is cut the rabbets on these. So there's a few different ways to actually work with rabbets when doing cabinets like this. You can either build the whole cabinet and then run a router-based rabbeting bit around the inside perimeter. That's one way to do it. I found in the past that when I've done this, that leads to a lot of tear out and a little bit more unpredictable. And I just generally don't like it. You can see my router table behind me here is fairly small, so it's hard to support a cabinet on it. And so we're going to be using the table saw to cut these rabbets, and it's going to be kind of interesting because I haven't actually set up a dado stack on my saw stop since getting it, so I'm kind of interested to see how it goes. Okay, so with our panels out of the clamps, you can see that there is a decent amount of squeeze out on the top. It's not a lot to be worried about, but when you pass this through the planer, if you leave that on there, you're gonna end up causing twisting and all these weird things to happen while it's riding through the planer. And so what I like to do is I have this really old crappy hand plane. Now this is like my great-grandfather's hand plane, but don't worry, any of you hand tool people out there, it's a super cheap, it's a Stanley Handyman, which back in the day would have been getting sold for like 20 bucks. This is kind of the equivalent of what the hand planes you'd pick up at Home Depot nowadays for like 30 or 40 bucks. And so I really don't feel that bad about using it to clear out glue like this, and it is actually a really fast, functional way of doing it. And I would never use one of my good Veritas planes to do this, just FYI for everyone. So there's a few different ways you can deal with glue squeeze out when you're gluing up panels. Normally I would use something like a putty scraper to just clean off the glue when it's somewhat dried, but I forgot to do that last night, and so I have to clean it up this way this morning. Another good way to do it is a card scraper can make pretty quick work of it. You can also buy specific glue scrapers. I know Lee Valley has one and it looks very expensive for what it does, but it does function properly. Or again, you can just go to Home Depot, pick up one of these super cheap hand planes. You don't have to keep a sharp edge on it. You want to sharpen it every once in a while just to make cutting the glue off a little bit easier, but you don't need to keep it sharp as you would keep a proper hand plane. And so before you actually put anything through the planer, you want to bring it over to your table saw or another flat reference surface and just double check the panels, because now is going to be your last chance to make sure that these are actually flat before you put them through the planer. If they have any kind of cupping, twisting, or bowing to them, this is when you're going to want to pull your hand plane or whatever method you like. You can use that same rubber sled method I showed you guys in the first video to make sure that these are as flat as possible. But my glue up went really well. These panels are all nice and flat, and so I'm good to go straight into the planer just the way they are. I don't have to touch anything up with my hand planes. That one might need a little bit of a touch up. And so one of the big things when you're checking these panels for flatness, you want to make sure that they're completely clear underneath. There's no chunks of glue. There's nothing on your flat surface, because again, if you're using a precision flat surface like a table saw, it's gonna any little, even the small amounts of dust can actually affect whether or not your thing is showing as having twist to it. So you want to make sure that your surface is nice and clean and that the underside of your panel is clean as well. And then you can put it on and check it, and it's showing up nice and flat. Another good way to check this is if when you lift up the panel, you feel just a little bit of suction. That's a really good sign that your panel is nice and flat. All right, and so all our panels are good to go. So we're gonna go straight into the planer now. So there's not a whole lot you can do here because you don't have any way of checking grain direction and all of that kind of stuff. When you're putting these panels in, because we focus more on the grain direction, the grain style of the panels, the best way to do this is just to take very thin amounts of material off on the planer. Now, with something like a lunchbox planer like I've got here, it can be a little bit problematic because they're not the most accurate thing. You can work in very small increments, but they can also still tear out pretty badly. Doesn't really matter. So another really good trick is to spray a little bit of water on it. And so if we get any tear out, I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. But basically all you need is a little spritz bottle like this, and all you're gonna do is lightly spray the surface. And so this works really well on like curly material, anything that has a lot of figure to it, or in cases like this where it might be going against the grain direction, spraying just a very, very light misting of water over the top surface. You don't want it soaking wet because that can clog up your machines and rust them from the inside out. But you want to just lightly mist the surface so it's slightly damp to the touch. That will just help prevent tear out. It's not going to completely remove it, but it does help it slightly, especially with single knife planers like this, or not single knife, straight knife planers, that's the word. And so to make sure we're as accurate as possible, I'm going to be using a setup block and a set of calipers here. Now, calipers are a pretty cheap thing. You can buy them on Amazon. I think this set cost me about $20. They're digital, which is really nice because I hate trying to read the ones with the little dial on them. Now, again, it doesn't really matter all that much because we're doing hand cut joinery, because everything doesn't need to be perfectly machined to a specific thickness. We can be a little bit over on either side. It doesn't really matter. Even if we're an 1/8 inch over and under, it's not going to matter that much. But I know for looks, I want to be right around that 5/8. So I've got my 5/8 inch setup block here and my set of digital calipers. And all I'm going to do is just pinch the setup block in there and set these to 0. And so when you're setting up your planer, what you want to make sure of is that you're not going just straight to referencing the wood. Now, it depends on what type of planer you have. If it's like this rigid one where it just has a little bubble or a little ball that references a single spot, you're going to want to make sure that you want to be referencing the wood, and you want to just go down slightly till you just touch the wood with that ball. So right now the little ball level or ball measure is measuring right at 0, which is exactly where I want it to be. And then I'm just going to go back up just a little bit and back down. What this will do is it'll make sure that I only take off the glue in small passes. Glue is extremely hard, and if you try to just take off a layer of wood and the glue at the same time, you're going to end up nicking and chipping your blades pretty badly. Most of the nicks on my blades on my planer have come from cutting through glue just like this on a panel, just taking off too big of passes in the first go. If you really want to keep the longevity of your knives, and you want to keep them as sharp as possible for a long time, I would suggest definitely cleaning up both sides of the panel with the hand plane or whatever method you like. But if you don't really care, the knives on this machine are super cheap, and I pass so much wood through here anyway. I have to replace them quite often anyway, and getting a few nicks here and there is not really a big concern for me. So I don't really worry that much about cutting glue on here. Alright, and so at this stage our panels are all completely flat, and you can tell that by when I pick up one, there's definitely a lot of suction between them, which means that they are all perfectly flat, even when referenced against each other, which is exactly where you want to be. That is just about as good as it gets in woodworking when you get nice, perfectly flat panels. And so, again, it's super easy to get those flat panels if you just follow the steps that we went over in the last video of gluing up your pieces nice and flat, using cauls to make sure the panels stay nice and flat, and then taking nice slow passes on the planer, make sure that nothing weird happens. And so all these panels are now perfectly flat and ready to keep moving on with. So our last steps are here at the table saw. So the first thing we need to do is, because we jointed one edge, we just want to make sure that the opposite edge is perfectly parallel to the edge we just jointed. I also like to cut one side of the table saw and then spin it around and cut off the edge that I just jointed, because my jointer doesn't do a great job of it. It's a straight knife jointer, just like my planer, and it leaves a little bit of tear on the edges, and I've got a few nicks in it, so it's not perfect. It's perfect along the edge, and we'll reference the table saw fence perfectly, but it just doesn't look very good, and trying to clean it up with the hand plane would create variation between all three panels. So I just like doing it. I like cutting both sides on the table saw because I think it gives the best end result and gives it most consistency along the edge, which I just like to do it that way. And so then once we've got everything cut to the same width, and we know we have two perfectly parallel edges, then we can go in and cut our panels to their actual final lengths. So again, we're going to be using two of these panels for the vertical sides, and then we're going to be cutting one of them in half to make our top and bottom pieces. Now, we're going to be deciding that after I do all that. I've got a pretty good idea of what I want. And so with our panels all cut to our proper widths now, they're all the exact same width. I know that because I know my table saw fence is perfect, and I set them all side by side and they all come out nice and perfectly the same width. And so having them the same width is very important for joinery, but now we're on to the part that can really make or break a project. And so what I want to do here is I want to look for my specific bad areas. So one that I know of is a spot where in the initial, before the glue up, we had the piece tear out right around a knot. That I know I want to be on the bottom or on the bottom of one of the sides, hidden behind a drawer where it's never going to be seen, no one's ever going to notice it. And so flipping that panel over, I know that this is going to be the outside of the panel. So I'm just going to take my pencil here, put an outside, and I think I'm going to call that one the left panel. Because one of the reasons I want to call it the left panel is because we have this area with this knot right here, or where that knot would be. And so I kind of want that to be on the back side of this panel so it's not as noticeable. And now it's going to be time to go over to the table saw. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is cleaning up one of the edges. Just that way it makes life a little bit easier. And so the better edges I want to mark on here before I actually go to the table saw so I don't accidentally mess up. And so again, going back to this piece where I had a little bit of tear out, I don't want to get too close to that because that tear out happened right around a knot, and trying to cut dovetails by a knot is really, really annoying and generally doesn't work out very well. And so what I want to do is I want to mark this as my short side. So I like to just put an arrow to show me where I'm cutting, and then I put an X on the long side. That just tells me that I want to trim this side as short as possible. So going basically right on this line right here, going across. That way I'm staying a good distance away from this knot. That's going to be problematic when I'm cutting dovetails. On the top here, it doesn't really matter because it's all clean, straight grain. It's going to be easy to cut the dovetails no matter where I cut there. And so that is our 4 panels, all cut to the exact same length and size and width and all that. So we now have 4 perfect panels all ready to be made into a cabinet. One thing I'm going to mention right here and now is this Krag miter gauge that you guys can see me using. I do not recommend it. I just want to make sure that's nice and clear. I know a lot of people, I know personally when I went shopping for a lot of the tools that I have, I looked at what other people on YouTube and other woodworkers I knew were using, and I copied them. And Krag was a brand that I thought was really good, but this miter bar is just about the worst quality miter bar I have ever dealt with. The problem is right now I'm stuck with it because none of the other ones that I want to order are available because of the pandemic. So again, I just want to make sure that you guys, woodworker to woodworker, I do not recommend this miter bar, just because even though everything is fully fastened down, it has a lot of play to it, and it's just not super accurate. So just wanted to make sure that was clear on here, just because you guys see me using it, doesn't mean it's good. Okay guys, so minor change of plans. My dado stack, well, not really a dado stack, a box joint cutting blade, doesn't actually fit in my saw stop. There's an issue with the blade. It's a little bit too long for what they're typically meant to be. But I do have a backup plan. I have an FTG blade, which is a flat top grind blade. I've got that installed in my table saw, and so what that allows me to do is to cut just make a normal cut like I would with the table saw, but it'll leave a nice flat surface, whereas most standard blades will leave kind of bat wing marks along the cut. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my panel and hold it vertically on the table saw and apply pressure against the fence and make my first cut. I want to do it this way because this allows me to have the most material supporting this piece while I'm making that cut and that through there. Then once I've got the cut going across, I'm going to then lie the panel down flat and then cut off the rest of the whatever piece is left over, and that'll give me a perfect rabbet. And so the reason you want to use an FTG blade for this is because where those two cuts meet, you want them to end up nice and perfectly square and flat. If you're using a standard blade, sometimes it works out nicely, but most of the time you want to try and use an FTG blade wherever possible. And so when you're doing the vertical cut, so when you're cutting it like this is generally a ill-advised way of making cuts on a table saw. Because the table saw fence is only 2 inches tall and this is a 10.5-inch panel, there's a good chance that if I apply pressure up top, I can twist and go into the blade and come back at me. And so the way I'm going to do this safely is by, when I'm doing the vertical cut, I'm going to be using my gripper block, and I'm going to be referencing this flat against the table saw, using that to apply pressure against the panel, and that should make it a nice, safe cut. I'm also going to do it in multiple passes. So I'm going about 5/8 of an inch up, so I'm going to start with a 3/8 cut and remove the bulk of the material, and then I'm going to raise my blade another 1/4 of an inch and finish off the cut. That way I'm removing as little material as possible, and it's all going to be very safe and easy to do with very little risk to me. And so again, the biggest thing, most important thing anytime you're dealing with a table saw or woodworking machinery in general, where you've got big heavy spinning blades, is you want to make the cuts as safe as possible. So the proper way to do this would be with the dado stack, but because I don't currently have a functional dado stack, I cannot do it that way. So I have to use the other methods to make the same cut. Alright guys, so we've now got our panels totally prepped and ready to go to cut some joinery tomorrow. So I'm not going to try and hide my mistakes, because it's easier if we all learn from this. So when I was cutting the when I was doing the second cut to actually cut out that little piece of extra material, and so you can see on this panel I actually left the blade just a little bit too high, and I ended up cutting right close to the surface, but luckily I didn't punch through. So this isn't a huge problem, because the way we're going to be doing these dovetails is we're actually going to be covering up this rabbet with the material on the outside panels. And so it's not a huge problem. It's kind of annoying that I did it because it's kind of unprofessional of me, but it's not a huge problem that it did happen. So there is ways that we can work around it. I just got to be careful that I don't break that rabbet off, because it'd be very easy to do right about now because there's very little material left there. But I noticed it pretty quick and stopped pretty quickly through. So it only went about 3 inches deep. So yeah, not ideal, but it's a mistake that's not a huge deal to fix in the future. And so, like I said, in the next video, we're going to be going over the dovetails, both the pins and the tails and the layout and all that. So the next video is going to be fairly long, but it's going to be focused totally on hand-cut joinery and doing the stuff mostly hand-cut joinery. And we're going to be trying to do a few different techniques here to help clean up our dovetails a little bit faster. But yeah, so it's going to be a good video. Make sure you guys subscribe and stick around. Check that one out when it comes out. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I will see you in the next one.